Hello, my name is Annette, and you are listening to The Heart of You. Today we're going to talk about those pesky predictions. Have you ever gotten a psychic reading and realized that some of the things that were said just didn't come to fruition? There's a reason for that. And it has nothing to do with the person who's reading for you, the fact that maybe they didn't get things right, which occasionally, we do get things wrong. But for the most part, it has to do with timelines. This is a little pop culture reference. If you grew up in the United States in the 70s and 80s, there were a series of books that were called Choose Your Own Adventure. And I loved these books. They were so, so good because what happened was at certain points in the story, it said, if you want to choose this direction, go to page whatever. And then if you want to go in this direction, choose this other page. And so the story changed based on the decision you made, based on whichever direction you wanted to go. So you could read the same book a couple of different times, actually, in fact, many different times, and come up with different outcomes, which I always thought was the coolest thing ever. So just like the Choose Your Own Adventure book, it is very, very similar in real life with timelines. Now, the first time I ever heard the term timeline in reference to what is happening in the future for your life was when I was working with my coaches, Dove and Nicole. They basically were working with me through a lot of my shadow work and helping me understand the things that I needed to work through at the time. And once I accomplished a certain level of transmuting energy or getting through various different trials or various different challenges that I had been working through for a really long time, Dove would say to me, you just collapsed a timeline. And I was like, what exactly does that mean? And she basically said, well, that timeline is no longer something that's going to happen. It's no longer available to you. When she first explained that, I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. But I still wasn't really grasping the idea of what it meant to collapse a timeline or for a timeline to not be available to me anymore. Of course, over the years, I eventually figured out exactly what it meant, but it did take time and it took my understanding of my own experience to be able to really take a look at all of the different timelines that were available to me and which timelines I was choosing based on my own free will and which timelines the universe was sort of nudging me towards. Let's start from the beginning. We all have free will. And if you feel like heading back to episode 30 of this podcast, I do a whole episode on free will versus destiny. Because we have free will, we have all of these different options and choices and decisions that we are making throughout the course of our daily lives. Now, some of those decisions have very little impact on our timeline. Some of those decisions have an immense impact on that timeline. Let's say you're getting ready to make a decision. I'm going to use an example from my past just because it's easier for me to connect those dots and show where it has gone since I made that decision. Go back to the decision I made about moving to Paris. There was a period of time in January of 2019 where I was contemplating moving to Los Angeles instead. So at that time, there were probably two solid timelines that were potentials for me at that time. So if you can just imagine that there are two paths, one is moving to Los Angeles, one is moving to Paris. And at that time, I was still very undecided because I had found this really incredible apartment on the beach just outside of Marina del Rey, and everything seemed really perfect with this apartment. I wasn't actually even looking for apartments. I just happened to be wandering and happened upon it and decided to go and look at the apartment. Everything was perfect, with the exception of they did not allow cats. that was a deal breaker for me. So that was that little universal nudge showing me that that was not necessarily the right direction. And I was cognizant enough at the time to know, okay, well, if everything is completely aligning with the exception of one thing, but that one thing is pretty major, then that's usually an indication from the universe that that's not the right direction. Here I am in January, and I'm sitting here trying to make this decision of whether or not I'm going to move to Los Angeles or to Paris. And I'm going through all of the different pros and cons. You know, I had family and friends in Los Angeles. I only knew like one person in Paris. I knew it was going to be easier moving to Los Angeles, but I had always wanted to live in Paris, and it was sort of my heart. So there were all these different things going on in my head. When it comes to the timelines, I had those two major timelines. But then there are all these other little baby timelines, if you want to think of them that way. So baby timelines would be something like another option. It would be another place that would be an option for me to live. So let's say another baby option would be to stay in Chicago where I was. Okay. Now that was a baby option because it was something that was very unlikely to happen. But because I hadn't made the decision yet, that timeline was still active. That timeline was still there. Even if it was small, it was a little baby timeline, it was still there. Now, there may have been maybe 3 or 4 or any infinite number of other timelines where maybe I could decide to move to Italy or decide to move to Japan or any other place in the world. But those other timelines are very unlikely because I had never actually considered moving to Japan. It wasn't anything that was in my consciousness. But moving to Italy, you know, that if something were to have happened that would have nudged me in that direction, I may have moved to Italy instead of to France. I also could have moved to some other tropical place. So I'm really big on oceans and, you know, tropical weather. So I really do gravitate towards those places. So one of those places could have popped up in my energetic field, and those would have become another little baby timeline that I could have considered. Now, was I really considering any other option? Not really. It was ultimately at that time, it was between Los Angeles and Paris. Those were the two most solid timelines. How does this work when you are getting a psychic reading or a reading that is going to help you for the future? Well, if you were going to get a reading at that particular time, at that crossroads, which I did, because sometimes when you're trying to make your own decisions, tapping into your own intuition can be super confusing, especially if you're really torn about two different things. Of course, I reached out for help. I spoke to Dove and Nicole, and I was like, hey, I really am deciding between these two things. What are you seeing in terms of what is in my highest good to do? And of course, they couldn't necessarily predict what was going to happen because I had not made a decision yet. So ultimately, those two major timelines were still very, very active. And depending on which way I chose, that would then solidify what could potentially happen in the future. Of course, they couldn't tell me what was going to happen, but they could say, okay, well, for Los Angeles, basically there were nothing but mosquitoes and annoyance if I were to move to Los Angeles. But then she saw nothing but like gold glitter and opportunity in Paris. That was just like that little indication. It was my guide's way of communicating to me that, hey, you could go either way, but if you move to Los Angeles, it's going to be annoying. You're probably not going to like it, and you're going to be irritated that you did it. But if you move to Paris, which is kind of where you want to go anyway, this is what's going to happen. So from that point, I tapped into my own intuition, and I felt into it and said, okay, yes, Paris is the way to go. That's the direction I'm going to go. At that moment, at that instant, I made the decision that I was going to move to Paris. I started the paperwork. I started getting the ball rolling. And ultimately, the timeline of me moving to Los Angeles has now been collapsed. So that means that that timeline for me moving to Los Angeles at that moment was no longer available. And the reason why it wasn't available is because I made the free will choice to not move there. Now, could that timeline have become active again? Sure. If, let's say, the paperwork, which we all know in France is significant, If there was a point in time where the paperwork was too frustrating or I decided to give up, then that other timeline to move to Los Angeles would have become active again. Or some of these other baby timelines could have become active again where I would have stayed in Chicago or maybe I would have gone somewhere else. The one thing that is really important to know about timelines and about the decisions that you are making is that they're fluid. It's not like I made the decision to move to Paris and all of a sudden there are no other timelines available for me and that's it. That's the only one and I have to stick with it and I cannot change my mind. That is absolutely untrue. It just so happens that for me, that was the decision I made. And I was like, I'm moving forward with this no matter what. I'm going to make sure that everything works beautifully. And in fact, it did because the universe was clear about the fact that I was meant to be here. So yes, I had challenges, but things did fall into place. And it got to the point where, yes, I knew I was meant to be here. And that's the little nudge I'm talking about. That's the little nudge from the universe. So that example is pretty cut and dry because it doesn't necessarily involve other people. It's a decision that I was making solely. It was for me and my life. And of course, there were other factors involved and other people involved in my decision-making process. But ultimately, that final decision was mine. So let's talk about something that's a little less clear-cut. Let's talk about a relationship. So let's say you're in a relationship with somebody and that relationship ends. And you decide, okay, I'm going to go to a psychic and I'm going to ask them, will we ever get back together? Is this something that is going to happen? This is where timelines can get super, super tricky because you have to really consider what is going on right then in there in that moment. Let's consider in this example that the couple had broken up 3 weeks prior and they hadn't spoken at all. They were still very much in their hurt. They were very much in their wounding and they were sort of going to each of their corners, so to speak. If that person went to a psychic right now in this moment and asked, are we going to get back together? Ultimately, the answer might be, no, you're not going to get back together. There's no possible way that this is going to happen based on your current timeline. So your current timeline at this moment is that you're not speaking to this significant other that you have just broken up with. You're in your wounding, you're not healing, you're feeling very stubborn, like maybe they have to come to you and that you're certainly not going to reach out to them because they need to come to you. If you're in this energy of stuckness and stubbornness and in your wounding, then the timeline that is the most dominant at this moment might be that no, you're not going to get back together. Now, this may be a good thing. It may be a bad thing. It just really depends on the situation. But let's say you do want to get back together with this person. That's where you have to do a little bit of investigation because if you got that reading at that 3-week point and you're still in your wounding, the answer is no, you're not getting back together. And let's say you waited another 2 to 3 weeks before getting that reading or that session. And then the information came in that yes, actually, in fact, there is a possibility that you might get back together because maybe that extra 2 to 3 weeks was enough time that you both needed in order to start getting out of your wounding, to start healing a little bit. And maybe during that 2 to 3 weeks, you've reached out to each other and started talking things through and started making amends and really starting to understand each other. So in that instance, if the session that you got basically said, no, you're not going to get back together. And yet, let's say 4 weeks later, you're back together and you're going to be like, well, that reading I got was completely wrong because we totally got back together. But that's also having to do with your own free will. So at that moment, you were not in a position or in an energy to be able to speak to your significant other or your ex-significant other. You were not in a position to really deal with your wounding. So at that moment in time, the reading was actually, in fact, correct because the timeline that you and your significant other would get back together was not actually a dominant timeline. It was probably a baby timeline hanging out there in the ethers. And then as you sort of healed a little bit more and dealt with whatever it was that was troubling you or whatever it was that broke you up, then that baby timeline grew into a larger timeline and then into a major timeline. And then it became the dominant timeline. They're constantly moving and changing and fluid in terms of your decision-making process. Now, a good reader will be able to tell you, hey, this is the outcome if you stay in your wounding. Okay. So they might be able to tap into one of those other baby timelines and say, okay, well, there is the possibility over here, but it's only going to happen if you do the work, if you reach out and speak to this person, or if you forgive this person for what happened or whatever it happens to be. But if you are stubborn and you are determined to stay in your wounding, you're not willing to do the work, you're not willing to forgive this person, and you're standing your ground and saying, you know what? Nope, he has to come to me or she has to come to me, and there's no possible way that I'm going to ever forgive them for anything. Okay, well then that's pretty definitive. That timeline has now been collapsed for that period of time, and the chances of you getting back together with that person are much smaller now, because now that is down to a baby timeline instead of being a major timeline. The other aspect that can have an incredible effect on timelines and your decision making when it comes to each of the timelines that are available to you are outside forces, outside information, things that happen over the course of time. You are making a decision right now based on the information that you currently have. But what happens when you have more information? Well, you have a tendency to rethink things, or maybe you are staying with the same decision, but now you have more information so you can actually make a better decision. So taking the example of the couple that has just broken up, and you have no information about why this particular situation happened. You haven't really had a really good conversation with your former significant other about why things happened the way that they did, or helping to understand from a place of compassion where that person was, etc. When you decide to have a conversation, get more information, then the situation may not have been as bad as you thought it was. And that then creates more timelines for you to choose from. Okay, now I have more information. Now I don't necessarily need to be in my wounding as much. Or let's say that was enough for you to start healing that wounding that you had within you. And then realizing that that other person was simply triggering that within you because it needed to be brought up to be transmuted and cleared. Whatever the information is that you receive that changes the course of your decisions, it's only meant to clarify or help you create the timelines that are for your highest good. A lot of times when I am asking my angels for help, I will say, thank you, angels, for helping me achieve the highest timeline for my highest good. Because there could be any number of timelines that would be perfectly fine for me for any given situation. But I want the one that is the best. And what does that mean? Well, that means sometimes you have to wait a little while. Sometimes that means that you have to wait some time in order for that timeline to become manifest. Another analogy and a way that you can look at it is if you picture yourself driving down a road and you decide to get off at a particular exit, and there's all kinds of traffic and everything. And it's funny because this actually happened to me in real life, where my friend Tina and I were on a road trip in the south of France, and it was during August. So every person in France was traveling. And we're driving down the freeway. We get off at an exit, and the line to get off the exit into this service station, it was insane, the amount of people. We saw the line, and before we fully got off the exit, we're like, and we're gonna not do that. So we changed our minds. We decided to keep on going, and we decided to get off the toll road. And when we got off the toll road, we were able to pay whatever it was we had to pay, and then go to a service station that wasn't on the toll road. And there was literally nobody there, not a single person. We went, got our gas filled up in our car. We were able to use the toilet, get some snacks. We were in and out in 10 minutes. When you think of your timelines like that, it's like you're driving down the road. Are you going to get off on that exit that's super, super difficult and that looks like it's going to be a total pain in the butt? Okay, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to keep on going on this particular timeline. Now, the thing about timelines is that because we're talking about having so many different ones, it's not just about driving down the road and having one choice of an exit. It's about driving down the road and having maybe 6 different exits come up all at the same time. And whether or not you're going to choose one is entirely up to you. And is entirely up to you on whether or not you're going to check in with your intuition to see if, hey, am I on the right path? Am I going down the right road right now? Because if I am, cool, I'll just continue on this road. But if I'm not, I want to know what my options are. And that's where going within and pausing and meditating, being mindful, all of those things, checking in, getting readings with people, getting psychic readings, those kinds of things, those are always helpful in those particular moments. If you get a reading and you get an intuition and all of these things, and the particular timeline that you thought was going to come to fruition does not, it doesn't mean that that timeline wasn't going to happen at a certain point. It is possible it was. But right now, with the trajectory that you are on, it is no longer available to you. Can it become available to you again? Absolutely. Okay, so this is the part in the episode where we start getting into a little bit more of the mystical ideas and theories about timelines. If you have your major timeline that you are currently on, imagine that you have another version of yourself. Imagine that there's like another dimension or another version of you that took that one exit and decided to do that other thing. So there's another version of me that took that exit and waited in line for 45 minutes. And that version of me was super annoyed. That version of me was getting really angry. That version of me was like, this is not fun. And then there's that version of me that continued down the road and got off at the toll road exit, went to the service station, and was back on the highway in 10 minutes. And then maybe there was another version of me that decided to continue on and not stop at that particular exit. And maybe try the other toll road service plaza to see if that one may have been less crowded. There may have been another version of me that tried a couple of other different things. Now, this is where the cool part of your intuition comes in, because in fact, this is exactly what happens when you are making these types of decisions. There is a version of you that makes another decision in another timeline, in another dimension. And so when you're tapping into all that is within you, which is to say that divine source energy within you, there is that part of your soul that already knows, hey, I already took this way. I already went this direction. And I already know that you're going to be super annoyed or irritated if you go in this direction. So that's where that intuition is saying to you, hey, don't do that because I already know that you're going to be irritated by that. Isn't that ridiculously cool? Some of the intuition that you get is from your higher self. It's from your soul who has broken off and taken that other timeline, come back and given you information and said, no, don't go in that direction. You don't want to do that. Have you ever done something and went against your intuition, where your intuition is telling you and screaming at you to do something or not do something and you do it anyway or don't do it? It's amazing because that is exactly what is happening. That version of yourself has already had that experience or already gone to a certain point in that experience and said, ooh, okay, maybe we don't want to go in that direction. Okay, let's go in this other direction and try this other timeline. Okay, cool. So tried this other timeline. This timeline is definitely better. What about this other one? Okay, well then there's another part of your source energy that goes out and experiences this major timeline and says, no, actually you're good. You're on the right path. Just keep on going. That is how you are checking in with yourself. That is your intuition. And oftentimes people ask me about when you're using your pendulum, who is it that's moving the pendulum? Well, it's you. And it is all of these other versions of yourself who have already gone through the process of going down these different timelines and deciding that, actually, you know what? No, it's not in your highest good to go and do this thing. It's funny because that exact same thing happened to me today. When I woke up this morning, I was like, oh, it's kind of a nice day. I think I might just go out and take a walk or, go to a park or something like that because I have sessions later on today. Maybe I'll just go out and do that. And I was feeling kind of guided to do that. And then I stopped myself and I was like, you know what? Maybe not today. And I was like, well, why not? And so I started investigating and I asked the question of my pendulum. And basically, the pendulum said no to the walk in the park. And I was like, okay, well, that's weird. All right, then, no problem. So I went and I took a shower. And while I was in the shower, I got this idea for this particular episode. Now, the seed had already been planted because I had a client just this past weekend who had me explain timelines to her because she wasn't really understanding exactly what it meant to be on a particular timeline. So I did explain it to her in this way, and it kind of did plant the seed of, oh, hey, maybe this would make a really good podcast episode. And then when I was in the shower today, it just came to me like that idea of the Choose Your Own Adventure book and all of these things. And so the second I got out of the shower, I was like, oh, okay, I need to record this episode now because it's fresh in my mind. The idea is fresh in my mind. And I really do want to get this done because for the next several days, I have a ton of sessions. I'm super busy and I'm not going to have a chance to record it. In that moment, I made the decision to not go for my walk in the afternoon and instead stay here, record the podcast before my next session is coming up in the next hour or so. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with timelines is that you're always going to get another chance. So don't worry about making the wrong decision or being on a wrong timeline because there really aren't any wrong timelines. It's about whether or not you're on a timeline that is for your highest good, that is going to propel you forward for your soul purpose. Or maybe this is a detour and the detour will also be used to your advantage. Let's say, for example, I decided to not record this episode today and I was like, okay, you know what? No, I'm going to go for a walk in the park because I really want some fresh air. I really want to be out in nature. I may have actually been able to record this episode later on in the week, but it may have been a completely different episode. I may have channeled the information a little differently because a little secret, a lot of these episodes that I record are actually fully channeled episodes. I don't write a script. I don't write anything down ahead of time. This is all just me channeling information based on the little seeds that have been planted and the information that I've gotten out of my meditations of, hey, this is going to be a really good subject to tackle. So that's how I actually create these episodes. When I made the decision to record this episode today, it was because a particular amount of information or a particular type of information needed to come through. Now, does that mean that if I had recorded the episode in 4 or 5 days that it would have been a bad episode or that it would have not been as good? No, that's not what it means. What it means is that for my highest timeline right now, recording this episode was going to be better for me because with my busy schedule coming up, I may have struggled over the next couple of weeks to get this episode out. Ultimately, this episode would have been recorded regardless. So whether I would have done it today or next week or the week after, it doesn't actually matter, but the experience would be different. So maybe it would stress me out more. Maybe it would be a different episode, as I said. There are always going to be multiple options and multiple opportunities to accomplish something that you want to accomplish or to make the decision that you want to make that is in your highest good, that is for your highest timeline. So to close out, if I want to go back to the original decision of me moving to Los Angeles or moving to Paris, had I decided to move to Los Angeles, does that mean that I would have never moved to Paris after that? Actually, no, probably not. What would have happened likely is I would have stayed in Los Angeles for 2 to 3 years because of the pandemic and everything else. And then, once the pandemic subsided, I probably would have made the choice to come here to move to Paris. It is something that would have changed my entire experience that I had over the last 3 years, But ultimately, if it was in my highest good to be here anyway, I would have ended up here. And that is what your guidance, that is what your intuition is always going to guide you toward. It's always going to guide you toward that highest timeline. And if you're off that path, if you're not on that highest timeline, they're going to communicate to you. Your angels are going to communicate to you, your guides, your intuition. Everything is going to start screaming at you in order for you to be able to understand what it is that is in your highest good and how to get you back on track. So next time you're about to ask a question of your intuition or maybe get a reading from somebody, ask yourself, is this the right time for me to ask this question? That's the first thing I would do. Ask your pendulum, ask your intuition, say, hey, I want to know this answer. Is this the right time for me to ask the question? And see what comes up. Or you could even write to whoever you're getting your session from. Hey, I want to make sure this is the right time for me to get a reading. Can you check in real quick and ask if this is the right time for me to get a reading? Or if I need to wait a few weeks or wait a month to get a reading? And chances are the person who reads for you, and I know I certainly do this for my clients, would be happy to check in and say, hey, is this the right time? I hope this has brought some clarity to this particular subject matter for you. It can be a little mind-boggling, so just let the information set in and just really feel into the information and start identifying those timelines that you're currently on and start working with them and see how much fun it is. If you would like to get a hold of me, you can reach me on my website at infinitesoullove.com. You can also subscribe on all social media at Infinite Soul Love 1111. That is YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram.